Hey everybody, welcome to Roman World, in which I introduce you to the last remaining rare Pokemon in the Jones-Lewis household, Kato! Kato Jones-Lewis! He's a bit of a cryptid, so he's a very rare find on any kind of public forum, and you are the first to see him on webcam. So, feel honored. Kato doesn't show up for just anybody. Okay. Today, I'm going to try my darndest to keep this short. I know I always say that. Oh, for crying out loud. And now Kato and Tethys are trying to eat each other. Pardon me. Okay, we're back. That's actually on topic, because we're about to go into another civil war, and also a foreign war, because Romans, multitaskers. We've left off with the reign of Gaius, but he's interesting because he's, well, interesting, and also a really good example of why hereditary autocracy isn't maybe the best way to run your state. You know, there are other bad ways to run your state too, but one of the problems is that hereditary autocracies are not a stable and nurturing environment in which to raise your children, and that the child who does grow up to rule your empire is likely to be processing a lot of trauma, deeply unstable, and may not even be competent. So, that is one of many lessons we can take from the reign of Emperor Gaius or Caligula. But we're now back to our overarching plot for this season. That is, how does a functional or dysfunctional republic devolve into a hereditary autocracy? Because we're not done yet. 5 emperors in, each emperor claims the authority as princeps, as first citizen, from a relative. Tiberius is Augustus's stepson. Gaius is Tiberius's nephew, I think. Claudius is Gaius's uncle, and Nero is Claudius's stepson and also his grandnephew, because Claudius ends up marrying his brother's daughter, who's Nero's mother, which is another thing that's really effed up about hereditary monarchies. Is that it incentivizes incest. At any rate, though, we still have a system in which Romans are telling themselves, well, we don't really have a king because these are just the heirs of Augustus. This is the family business. They have this extraordinary role in the state. They're helping us out, but we can still switch back to a republic anytime we want, anytime at all. Bless their hearts. Denial's a wonderful thing. And that's what it is. But they're not wrong either. There is one last piece we need before we have a fully functioning autocratic state. And that is making the office of princeps, of emperor, an office that will survive even after the family is gone. In other words, you need a multiple dynasty situation. And that's what we're about to talk about here, because Nero is the last of the emperors to be related to Augustus. Here I've color-coded the dynasties a bit so you can see them as they pop up. Light blue is a series of failed attempts to create a dynasty. You'll notice the dating is also a little bit hinky. That's the year we're about to focus on, the year 69 CE, the most memorable date in human history. This is the year that Rome collectively, screws itself. Sorry, I know that's somewhat tasteless, but also it's memorable, so use it in good health. Forgive me in my potty mouth. Vespasian starts the second dynasty of Roman emperors, and this is the moment where that last piece of hereditary imperial power falls into place. Until Vespasian, imperial power on paper is still justified by the dynasty claiming they're relatives and heirs of Augustus. With Vespasian, he takes over the household of Augustus, he steps into the place of Augustus, but he doesn't claim to be related to Augustus. Like, he doesn't get himself officially adopted retroactively, he doesn't make himself part of this new dynasty in anything except title. He takes the name Caesar, but by now this is a bit of a legal fiction that's lost any of its original meaning. When Augustus makes people call him Caesar, that is his ticket to power, and that's why he is so gosh darn insistent about it. But by Vespasian's time, Caesar has ceased to be a family name and has instead become a job description. Excuse me, I need to intervene in yet another civil war. This is like performance art. I apologize for my cats, they're very rude. There's a reason why Cato doesn't come out to be on TV very often. Okay. Now, you'll notice that Vespasian's dynasty doesn't last all that long. There are 3 people in it, Vespasian and his 2 sons. After this, though, we do end up with a pretty stable period that is technically a dynasty. Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian are the first 3 of a 6-emperor dynasty. This period's also referred rather shadily to as the 5 good emperors. Now, Dr. Jones-Lewis, you may say, didn't you just say there are 6 emperors in this dynasty? Yes, there are, but the last one doesn't get the good label. Contemporary historians really disliked him, and you've met him. How many of y'all seen Gladiator? Yeah, Commodus? That's the dynasty that he manages to kill. Whether or not, he wasn't like Joaquin Phoenix levels of messed up. That movie is not great as a history of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, but you'll notice I'm not saying it's an inaccurate movie. Yeah, its political history is highly suspect. It doesn't get that very right at all. But I love Gladiator. Full disclosure, it's one of my favorite movies set in ancient Rome because it does get right the feeling of 2nd century CE Rome. The huge, sprawling scale of it, the multiplicity of cultures, the destructive influences of human trafficking, the politically treacherous landscape, and the incredibly diverse groups of people who were self-identifying as Romans. All of this Gladiator gets really, really well. I adore that movie. I really do. Because, movies are never going to be accurate. Like, what do we mean by accurate anyway? Our historical records themselves aren't, like, accurate. They're written by people with agendas, and a lot of them are tangentially in contact with the truth. And even if you're getting it from the person who is involved, like, say, Caesar's Gallic Wars, fact-checking Caesar, not really doable. And you have to fact-check politicians, because politicians lie. They do. Sorry, I hope that doesn't come as a surprise. All of this is to say, we're now at a pivotal moment, and in order to understand how the office of emperor gets this final piece put in place, we need to talk about the events leading up to and within the year 69 CE. For this unit, I've given you one required and one optional movie. For the Emperor Gaius, I've given you Mary Beard's Caligula. It's great. It's fantastic. I could add to it, but you get enough of me already. I've given you an optional movie about the Jewish wars that I find is really interesting next to the events we're about to read through. It, however, has some historical problems. It's from the same series that did the Tiberius Gracchus movie, and like the Tiberius Gracchus movie, there's a specific agenda in the way it's written. They're very sympathetic to Flavius Josephus, and they're a little bit sketchy about the reasons why Judea is in open rebellion at this point. I find that the narrative that results tends to be very interested in Roman power, but not as interested in the experience of people living in Judea in the first century. And that's because it's telling a story in an hour. They had to pick and choose. So here I'm going to give you some context that'll help flesh that out. But I think that it's really well done. It's well worth watching, and it might help you to connect with the dynamics we're about to talk about in this lecture. You don't have to watch it, but the Daily Motion links up in case you do. Okay, that's the hemming and hawing. Let's dig in, shall we, to the last years of the reign of Emperor Nero. And the Great Revolt of 66 through 70 CE. They have to call it the Great Revolt because it's not the first and it's not the last. And it's not that Judea is a particularly revolt-prone front. Several other Roman provinces have varying degrees of rebellion and resistance. That's what happens when you take over somebody else's country, is resistance and sabotage, and also shifting alliances as people who benefit from colonial power jockey with each other. Same is true of Judea. Judea is useful to us, though, as historians, because we have more information about it than we do some other provinces. This is due in part to there being an alternative supply line of historical sources coming out of this region of the Mediterranean, because Jewish people who existed in the Mediterranean and still exist, as all of you know very well, continue to exist even under the rule of people who are not themselves Jewish. This is a little unusual. In most cases, with colonialism, there comes erasure, both deliberate and coincidental. But because of the unique circumstances surrounding the religion of Judea and Jewish folks, and because there was an existing network of Jewish people throughout the Mediterranean that allowed Jewish people after 70 CE to continue to preserve their own history, including histories that problematize and speak back at Roman history. One of them we're going to look at later when we talk about the emergence of and rise of Christianity. Christianity grows out of the ancient Jewish community, and it provides yet another stream of information preservation. But it's not the same as Judaism. Similar religions, similar roots, but culturally different from the middle of this century, the first century. What this means for you now is that in Judea, we have an unusually good opportunity to fact check the Roman version of what happens here and to resist the Roman narrative of occupation and conquest. However, this conflict is in some ways escalated by things that have nothing to do with how Judea is reacting to their own oppression. In some ways, Judea is the wrong province at the wrong time in the wrong region, and ends up becoming a victim of a conflict that has very little to do with them. I'll explain what I mean as we're going ahead, but that's why we're talking about this. This revolt begins in the year 66, but it's been brewing for longer than that. The 1st century CE began with a united Judea ruled under Herod the Great, who was, if I remember correctly, I think this is correct, the last of the Herodian dynasty to control all of Judea's traditional territory. After his death, there's a succession dispute that Rome is heavily involved in. By now, Judea has been a friendly kingdom to Rome for many, many years. And in fact, there's still a pretty good amount of goodwill between Judea and Rome. And this has to do with Rome's participation in supporting Judea's independence when they first broke from Macedonian Greek rule under the Seleucids. You don't have to remember this. This is just backstory. So at first, Romans were seen as allies to the Jewish nation. And it's in that capacity that Rome continues to cooperate with first the Maccabean dynasty and then the Herodians. But as the 1st century proceeds, the situation weakens somewhat. Herod the Great leaves a contested succession. Judea is divided into different districts. Eventually, Herod Agrippa, I think that's the grandson of Herod the Great, is able to get back a lot of that territory, partly due to his friendship with the Emperor Claudius. But then towards the end of his life, this relationship breaks down. He dies of horrifying natural causes. But the damage is done. Judea is never united again as a single area. Rather, it's split up into 4 different governing districts, some run by kings, including Herod Antipas, who's the king in the region of Galilee, and other parts that are ruled by Roman proxies. So it's not an official, fully fledged Roman province at the beginning of this revolt, but it's not exactly an allied independent kingdom anymore either. Entire parts of it are being ruled directly by Roman procurators. These are deputies sent by the Roman emperor to take charge of the day-to-day running of Judea. And kings that have to run their plans by Rome to function under constant suspicion. Judea is now paying taxes to Rome in the form of tribute, and with the process of levying these taxes, you have a culture wherein some local people are collaborating with the Romans to collect Roman revenue, while other people are resisting paying this money. This money is also increasing over time. What's also increasing over time is the reliance of Roman emperors on religious mechanisms to give their authority legitimacy and to create litmus tests for loyalty. This is already starting, as I mentioned in the Augustus lecture, Augustus and Virgil, with Augustus and the deification of Julius Caesar. After Augustus's death, Augustus is deified. There's an official cult. If you don't participate in the worship of the divine Augustus, then that's seen as a suspicious lack of patriotism. For polytheistic people in the Mediterranean, it's not an unreasonable ask to worship the emperor. This has to do with traditional ideas of heroism and promotions for certain mortals. We're going to unpack this when we talk about the rise of Christianity, so that's coming up. Today, suffice to say that for most people, this wasn't the worst thing. When the empress came in and demanded to be worshipped, it was tacky, but it wasn't a no-go. In Judea, however, for those of you who aren't familiar, one of the central tenets of belief for Jewish people and for people coming from a tradition based out of the Abrahamic religions. These are religions that trace their descent back to a man named Abraham and a God who has some very specific and rather unusual for the Mediterranean terms of belief. This includes a prohibition against worshiping any other gods and an insistence that this one God be treated in a way that didn't allow space for any images, any pork-based sacrifices. This is going to be important in a minute. But some of the rules are the same, both for polytheistic religion and for early Judaism. The land around the temple, full disclosure, temples. Samaria had an alternative temple. For most Jewish people, though, the official temple was the temple in Jerusalem. Judaism was unusual in that one God and also one temple. But the rules around the temple weren't that unusual. There was animal sacrifice. It was done outside of the temple proper at an altar. The animals had to be ritually pure. The walled district around the temple consisted of holy ground. There are all of these purity rules about who can and cannot go there. These rules are extended to smaller places of worship, synagogues, for instance. Some of these rules would differ depending on which Jewish community you were in. One of the things that's different about first century Judaism and modern Judaism, most modern Judaisms, I should say, is that it was a period where Jewish people were actively recruiting new membership and encouraging people to join who weren't Jewish by blood. This led to a rise in popularity for Jewish converts in the first century. There were so many of them in Rome that it got to be a bit of a punchline to Roman poetry of the time. The same was true in Alexandria. What happened between now and then was that a lot of these Jewish converts end up becoming the same people who later become early Christians and then splinter off into early Christianity. Not all, but some. Now, I've made it sound like Judaism is a bit of a monolith in this period, but it's not. There are local traditions in Samaria, as I mentioned. There are also different schools of thought about how one should live out their devotion to the God of Judaism, what one's responsibility is to the laws of Judaism, how they should be enforced, how women are treated, how prayer should be done. It's a living religious tradition then as now. Right. On to the Revolt of 66. Oh, no, I'm not quite done. Sorry. I was going a place with this other than telling you cool fun facts about ancient Judaism, which is super interesting. I'm low-key geeky about this. Full warning. With Emperor Gaius's rise, you may remember that the Emperor Gaius got into a bit of trouble because he deified himself while he was still alive. That, for polytheists, was considered a bit tacky. Now, the Emperor Claudius was also deified in his lifetime, but only in the province he had conquered, the province of Britannia, which is what today is southern England, exclusive of Wales and most bits of Scotland, and also a little bit of the north of England. After his death, though, Claudius was fully deified. The Emperor Gaius moved to deify himself in his lifetime, and then also required that statues of himself be set up in major temples all over the Mediterranean. This was a power move. This was meant to consolidate his authority and also to weed out people who weren't loyal. He required this of all communities, inclusive of Jewish communities, especially those in Alexandria and in Jerusalem. he wanted there to be a statue of himself erected and put into the temple in Jerusalem, which is unacceptable on a number of fronts. First, it's a graven image. That's a no-no. You're not supposed to make an image of God in most kinds of ancient Judaism. It's just no. And if you do make an image of God, you shouldn't make him look like the Emperor Gaius, and also you shouldn't worship the Emperor Gaius because he is not Hashem, the god of Judaism. It's no. This wasn't all, though. Gaius required that a pig be sacrificed in his honor as part of his cult. If you know anything about Judaism, you know that one of the meats you're not supposed to eat and that is unclean, ritually impure in any and all circumstances is pork. So Jewish folks had just been asked to violate several of the major no-nos of their religion. And this resulted in a lobbying mission from the Jews of Alexandria to the Emperor Gaius. This generated a report that was sent back to the Jewish community in Alexandria. We still have it. If you're interested, Google Philo's embassy to Gaius and their translations on the internet. It's very long. Philo of Alexandria was chatty. It's notable, though, Mary Beard mentions this document. It's our only contemporary record of an eyewitness who met the Emperor Gaius. And it is both problematic for people who like to think of Gaius as this unhinged lunatic who's completely ridiculous. He's in charge of his own mind. He's coherent. But he's even more terrifying because of that. He's just coherent enough that he's mocking the Jewish ambassadors. He makes fun of their religious beliefs. He humiliates them in front of his court, and he makes them meet with him not in an audience chamber, but while he's on this home and garden tour of this estate. And they're running off after him while he's looking at his friend's house and trying to get in there lobbying while Emperor Gaius is only vaguely paying attention. This in some ways is even more chilling. A leader who is completely incompetent to the point of being unable to govern at all, like say they're so mentally or physically unwell that they can't show up to press briefings. I mean, that's bad, but maybe it's not the worst thing. I find even more terrifying someone who is just competent enough to show up and continue to govern and create a sense of terror and desperation in his followers who are willing to support him in his gaslighting, abusive dipshittery, which is what we have going on in Philo's embassy to Gaius. And it's partly why I take a bit of a dim view of Gaius. Some historians have tried to rehabilitate him a bit. I think that's fair, that's okay, I'm not judging them. But what I get from Philo's document of his embassy to Gaius is that the Emperor Gaius was dangerous. He was intolerant, he was unresponsive to the needs of minority groups inside of his own empire, and that troubles me in a leader. I want a leader who cares whether or not his people feel violated, yes? I hope you do too. That's important. Gaius doesn't seem to be that person. Now, these statues, the one in Jerusalem never gets put up because Gaius is assassinated before he can follow through. So in some ways, the situation's saved. But then the next emperor, Nero, also is a problematic emperor in ways that we don't have enough time to unpack in depth. So sorry, guys. I have to pick and choose, and I'm gonna sacrifice Nero, except for a little bit. Just a little bit of Nero. Nero's fun, but only if you don't have to be his subject. 66 is well within the reign of Nero, and it's in 66 that Jewish communities reach their breaking point. Now, early on, there was a compromise reached that allowed Jewish communities to pay a tax rather than sacrifice to the emperors Augustus and then later Claudius, Julius Caesar, or anybody else for that matter. And this worked up until the reign of Nero. Let's explore what went horribly wrong, shall we? Now, we do have to talk a little bit about Nero, and here I'm giving you two of his portrait busts. The one on the left is the one you'll see a lot. There's a horrifying attempt to paint in his features floating around the internet. We've already talked about why that's a problematic historical project. I'm fine with it as art. But it's really problematic here because a lot of this bust is restoration. However, the neckbeard is a fashion statement. As a Roman emperor, it was felt to be undignified that Romans have beards. Beards are a Greek thing. And at this point, it was considered undignified for a Roman emperor to look too Greek. However, the Emperor Nero was kind of a frustrated rock star. Imagine that guy, in high school, right, who really, really wanted to be a rock star, but he was only kind of good. Now, imagine that he gets put in charge of the Mediterranean, and then he uses his authority to go to music competitions and win. Like, he gets on American Idol, and because he's the emperor, the nation votes for him because you better vote for Nero. That's Nero. Those politicians who had to work under him, including my bestie, my ride or die, Pliny the Elder, they had to go to his concerts, and if they weaseled out of going to his concerts, they'd get in trouble. One of our next players in this mid-century drama, the Emperor Vespasian, spoilers, future Emperor Vespasian, he was one of Nero's generals, and he gets in trouble because at one of Nero's concerts, he falls asleep and he gets caught. And he's lucky. He escapes with his life. He's not accused of treason, but they pack him off to the worst military assignment they can think of. Judea. Dun, dun, dun. Now, there are other stories about people trying to get out of Nero concerts. There's one guy who faked a heart attack, and when Nero found out, he stopped letting people leave Nero concerts. And these things would last for hours, sometimes all day. There's a story of one senator's wife who was forced to go to a Nero concert. She went into labor and had her baby in the middle of the Nero concert because Nero wouldn't let her go. That there's a power move. Guess that's memorable for the kid. It's a great story to tell him later, but that is not the situation in which I would like to give birth to a child, really. That seems unsafe and unsanitary. Now, all of this is kind of funny. It's eccentric, but it doesn't really get at how terrifying it was to live under Nero. He, even among his other dynasty members, all of whom had a lot of people executed on charges of treason, Nero was particularly fond of accusing people of treason for really tenuous reasons. And not only would he accuse you of treason, but he came up with this idea where he would inform you ahead of time that he was going to accuse you of treason. And because if you're executed by the state, your will is no longer valid. All of your property goes to the state. Your children get nothing. But if you die before your trial, then your kids can inherit. Nero used this against his victims. He's, in essence, a political serial killer. What he'd do is he'd send one of his enslaved physicians to go visit you, along with the message that, hey, heads up, I intend to accuse you of treason. The physician would be there to help you kill yourself. On orders, essentially. And that's how this panned out, is that people would get a note from Nero, and they'd have to kill themselves. Some of them made it a protest. He did this to people he was formerly really close to. For instance, his philosophy tutor, a guy named Seneca, he was implicated perhaps in a conspiracy against Nero, ordered to kill himself. But this isn't the worst thing yet. Serial murder by political fiat isn't the thing that makes me incredibly unfond of Nero. Nor is being mean to Pliny the Elder, for that matter. Although I am mad about that. Because why be mean to Pliny? He's adorable. He loves elephant facts. At any rate, the Emperor Nero was a serial spouse abuser and murderer. Not just his spouses, but also his mom was one of his victims. He tried to kill his mother multiple times. At the end, he tried to rig a boat to collapse while she was out in the harbor on a pleasure cruise. It didn't work. She swam to safety, and when she got back to her house, he then sent armed men to kill her directly. According to Tacitus, one of our historians from this period, she said to the people sent to kill her, "Look, stab me in the uterus, because enough with this shit. I can't believe I gave birth to such a little douchebag." She doesn't say douchebag, but I'm paraphrasing here. Side note, Agrippina is Caligula's sister. It's really sad. So he kills his mom. His first wife, Octavia, the Emperor Claudius's daughter, he exiles her and then starves her to death. She was very popular, and people were super horked off about this. He also allegedly, but probably, poisoned his adopted brother Britannicus. This is Claudius's biological son. Kills him off so that he's left with sole command of the empire. And then his next wife, a woman named Acte, when she's pregnant, he gets really angry at her and kicks her to death. So we're two spouses and his mom and his brother he's killed now. We're not done yet, though, because apparently after he kills Acte, he just feels... Sorry, not Acte. Wrong name. I'm so sorry. Drat. What is her name? Oh, no. Hold on. I need to consult my notes for once. I'm such an idiot. Poppaea. Poppaea is his wife's name. So he kicks her to death, and then he feels really bad about it. This does not lead him to go into counseling and work on his anger management and maybe not do violence to his spouses anymore. No. What he does next is he finds an enslaved person named Sporus, who resembles Poppaea, and then he orders that Sporus be castrated and dressed as a woman. At this point, Nero marries Sporus in like a high-profile wedding, and then lives with Sporus as his wife. Now, you'll notice I'm being very careful not to give Sporus a gender here, because it's tempting to look at this as a story about a transgender person, but we have to keep in mind that's not what's going on here, because Sporus's identity is not important to Nero. Nero doesn't care. All Nero sees is that, oh, you look like my wife, whom I just killed, and I feel bad about it. So you're close enough. And then he violates Sporus's bodily integrity by having him castrated, which is not cool. Like, I think it's fairly... I don't have to explain, right, why non-consensual castration is bad. If you're not familiar, castration is the removal of the testicles in order to turn off testosterone testosterone production. There are a couple methods for doing this in antiquity. This lecture's already long. I won't tell you how, but I know. It's like an article I'm writing right now. It's not as creepy as it sounds. At any rate, Sporus survives Nero, but he's killed by an angry mob. Or sorry, they. I'll go with they because we don't know what Sporus's gender actually was. Nobody bothers to care, and he ends up very badly. Although, while Nero's alive, people do, some of them, acknowledge the existence of this marriage. The minute Nero's dead, it turns out very badly for the surviving spouse / victim. It's a story that really deeply depresses me. No, I'm not even going to try to rescue that one. Okay, so for all of these reasons now cited, it is my considered opinion as an ancient historian that Nero was an asshole. Leaving all that aside, though, not only wasn't he an asshole, but he was a short-sighted imperial governor. And his decisions, as well as those of his administration, are about to lead to an open armed rebellion. And quite frankly, good job. We need to talk about Procurator Florus and the Publicani. I've mentioned these folks before. These are the local subcontractors who are hired by Romans to collect tribute. Just to remind you about the dynamic here. When a Roman governor or procurator would be sent to administrate a Roman province, one of their duties was to oversee tax collection. However, the governor themselves wouldn't be the person doing this because it was felt to be inappropriate for somebody of senatorial class to be involved in anything other than the management of Italian plantation farms. This was meant to be a bit of a check and balance to keep senators from insider trading. They insider traded, but they had to maintain an appearance that they weren't. In order to then collect tribute and then pass the tax revenue back to Rome, they would hire somebody of the equestrian class. Now, the equestrians would bid to be the official tax collector for the province. Whoever promised that they would collect the highest amount of revenue would then get the contract. However, the rule was that if you collected more money than you had promised in your winning bid, you get to pocket the difference. What this meant was that when tax collector management was competing to get the bid to collect taxes for a province, they were incentivized to create a reasonable-ish figure. However, what they were actually collecting was not at all reasonable. This system actively incentivized the collection of disproportionate and punitive taxes from those least able to resist. The way they went about getting this surplus plus tax revenue was by hiring locals to do the groundwork. So the winning equestrian would hit dirt in the province. They and their administrative staff would hire local people in Judea, local Judeans, who would then collaborate with the Romans. They themselves and their family would get a favorable deal on their taxes in return for assessing their neighbor's tax bracket. So imagine, picture your neighbor right now. Okay, now imagine that your neighbor is living next to you in a country that's being occupied by a foreign power. Okay, we're there? Okay. Now, your neighbor volunteers to collaborate with this administration and then goes on to tell them about the extra goat that you're hiding in your backyard, or the really nice bucket of gold that your grandparents left you. Thus informed, your tax bill goes up sharply, your neighbor's does not, because, well, your neighbor's not going to inform on themselves, are they? If this makes you feel kind of cheesed off at your neighbor, that's a very authentic reaction. That's how people felt about this in Judea. This is why tax collectors are the most, or at least among the most loathed people in first century Judea. It's not just first century Judea. Everywhere that the Romans are governing, tax collectors are the worst. And I'm saying that in all senses. I, too, think that these tax collectors are the worst. This is not good neighborship. And I think even Mr. Rogers would be hard-pressed to pat this kind of neighborliness on the back. So, we're in Judea. It's 66 CE. And the Procurator Florus is working for Nero. Now, shit rolls downhill, yes? And Nero was spending a lot of money because he liked pretty clothes and lavish spending. He traveled a lot, and he was also really into some questionable discretionary spending. Apart from unnecessary castration procedures, he also financed a lot of fortune tellers. At one point, he paid for some magi, some holy men from the Parthian Empire, modern-day Iran, Persia, to travel overland to the city of Rome just to tell his fortune. This was highly unpopular at the time. But then, in the year 64 CE, the city of Rome burned down. Not the whole thing, but most of it, including the temple districts, the forum, major residential centers. This left thousands, hundreds of thousands of people dead. Hundreds of thousands, that might be a large figure. Lots of people died. Property was damaged. Nero suddenly found that he had to pay for a massive rebuilding program. Nero needed money. Nero doesn't like budget cuts. So Nero starts leaning on his procurators to raise even more tax revenue. Florus, partly in desperation, partly because he's a jerk, starts leaning on his province, Judea, in particular the city of Jerusalem. He decides that he's going to go into the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and take out of it gold implements, wealthy offerings, appropriate them, and send them back to Rome for his portion of the tax revenue. At this point, the locals begin a peaceful protest, where they start going up to Florus in the streets and offering them him their pocket change. Why is this a protest, you may ask? Well, they were saying, "Oh, Florus, he's so poor he has to steal from our god? That's not cool. Florus, if you were so hard up, you should have just asked for spare change. Like, here's a quarter. Take my quarter, Florus." Now, Florus didn't find this funny at all. So he hauled off and had the protesters executed. This raised an outcry because a lot of these people were religious figures. As in most protest movements, clerics are at the heart of it. With the murder of high-ranking officials in Jerusalem, including priests and other holy people, the province was up in arms. They also saw that Nero was going down the Caligula path of self-deification. The empire was unstable. Judea was no longer profiting from their relationship with Rome. And it looked like a time where continued participation in Rome had benefits that just weren't worth it anymore. And revolution seemed like not the only option, but the best option if Judea was going to continue its religious autonomy and protect itself from utter financial ruin. Full disclosure, I kind of support this rebellion. I kind of like rebellions in general. I like an underdog. Now, this rebellion was in some ways perfectly timed because the Nero administration was rapidly barreling towards crisis. 66 CE is the year that the incident with Florus sparks off the rebellion. You may recall that the Emperor Nero dies in the year 68. That's, 2 years out. Within those 2 years, elsewhere in the empire, other provinces go into armed revolt. And the dynamic looks a lot like the dynamic in the late Republic, because a lot of these generals, many of whom are in these provinces in the first place because Nero got sick of them and sent them there, realize, hey, I've got some legions. I could be emperor. I could be a better emperor than Nero. And in fact, if I don't kill Nero, Nero might kill me. So really, marching on Rome sounds like a sustainable solution to these folks' personal and professional problems. And that is exactly what happens. We're looking now at a map of Rome in 69 CE. Here it says AD. CE is the same thing as AD. Just, I like CE. I think it's more fair. In 69 CE, Galba is the first general to go into open rebellion. Galba is well positioned. He's got the lion's share of the province of Spain. And with that, I think he has, 3 legions, if I remember properly. He's well connected. He's on the outs with Nero. People in Rome are willing to support him. So he takes his legions, marches them overland into the city of Rome, and Nero is unable to muster enough support to resist him. Other generals are slow to defend Nero, because what goes around comes around, Nero. Nero is forced to flee to his country estate, where, finally cornered, he is then forced to take his own life in order to avoid being, publicly humiliated, executed. And that's what he does. Unfortunately for Sporus, this ends in an angry mob, but Nero's gone. However, we're at a point constitutionally where other generals are watching, and they realize when Galba does this and gets himself declared emperor, which is where this goes. This is still the year 68 CE. So in 68 CE, Galba's the new emperor. And then other generals are like, oh, so you don't have to be related to Julius Caesar to get to be emperor. That's interesting information. That's information I could use. Hey, I've got a legion. I could be emperor. Welcome to the year 69 CE, otherwise known as the Year of 4 Emperors. Guess why? Yeah, that's why. At the beginning of 69, Galba is still in charge, but you'll notice not for long. January 15th, Galba is defeated by Otho, his neighbor. Otho is in that gray territory in modern-day Spain and Portugal. It's a little bit of Lusitania and then inland Spain. With his legions, he marches on Rome, and he takes over from Galba. But oh wait, Vitellius, who is the governor of both Britain and of Cisalpine Gaul, that green territory, realizes, I have more legions. In fact, I'm in Britain, an active war zone. Not only do I have legions, but I have legions who have been in a battle recently. They're seasoned. They're professionals. I could be emperor. So he marches over the Alps into the city of Rome, takes out Otho, and himself becomes emperor. But wait, we're not done, because there is Vespasian. He's in the gray territories, so the Danube region was his base of operations before he was sent to be governor of Judea. Once in Judea, Nero sends him to Judea because Nero hates him. Yeah, he fell asleep at the concert. So he's given a province that is felt to be difficult to impossible to rule. It's an open rebellion. It's just meant to be a huge pain in the ass. What ends up happening in 69 is that Vespasian realizes my legions are more seasoned than Vitellius's legions. And by 69, his suppression of the revolt in Judea is going pretty well. He's made inroads. He's kind of down to the last gasps of defeating Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is a hard nut to crack, but Vespasian decides, you know what? I have my son with me. His son is Titus. I can leave him to finish this war in Judea. I can take some of my spare legions. I can get some of my loyalists back on the Danube to come with me. The Danube is another active war zone. These are battle-hardened troops. Some of Rome's elite troops, too, because you put your elite troops in the hot zones. With these forces, he marches into Rome, takes over from Vitellius, and on December 21st, 69 CE, Vespasian becomes the fourth emperor active in the year 69. But you'll notice we're not out of provinces yet. There are all these pink provinces, each of which has their own governors with their own legions. Vespasian knows that his decision means that somebody else with a legion can march into Rome and do what he did. It's trendy now. Hell, Vespasian's not even original for thinking of it. What this means is that Vespasian is now incentivized to win the war in Judea as quickly as possible and with extreme prejudice. Because, well, it's seen as tacky to make a point out of your victories over other Romans, right? You remember this from Augustus. Sure, civil wars are a bit of a Roman tradition, but it's considered tacky to celebrate triumphs for them. You're not supposed to brag about them in public forums. You're supposed to act like you're really sad you had to do the Civil War thing, even if you're not. However, foreign wars are a respectable Roman tradition. You can totally have a triumph for a foreign war, and winning one is a way that Vespasian can do one better than his rivals. He's in one of the few provinces that's in the middle of an active war right now. He doesn't even have to start a war. He's already got one. So if he beats down Judea really, really extra hard, then he's sending a message to all of his remaining generals. Stick with Vespasian. If you go up against Vespasian, he is going to do horrible, horrible things to you. This drives all of the events for the rest of this lecture, and I'm terribly sorry. This is about to take a very depressing turn. More genocide, guys. So sorry. In case you're wondering what they looked like, here are the portraits of the four emperors with their dates. I'm not going to belabor this, we just did this, but here they are. Hi, guys. Yeah, that's all I have to say about these folks. Vespasian, what he's about to do here works. He remains emperor for a decade, and he's older when he comes to power. He's succeeded by his older son first and then his younger son. So he does succeed in creating a dynasty. With Vespasian, the office of Roman emperor now becomes something that you can win through battle even if you're not related to Augustus. And it also is something that you can successfully turn into a new dynastic system. So what's happened here is that the institution of emperor as a hereditary monarchy survives the existence of the initial family holding it. It's now become a part of Rome's constitution that is much, much harder to get rid of. Rome never not had, oh god, that sentence is horrible. Rome, in the form we see it here, never functions again without an emperor. Either as a unified empire, nor when it splits into East and West. And this problem we've introduced, the problem of generals who can fight with each other to take over the throne, is never solved. A stable dynasty manages to hold on during the 100 CE, But moving into the 3rd century CE comes a period called the Crisis of the 3rd century, which is a crisis for exactly the reasons I've just outlined. Lots and lots of generals kill lots and lots of other generals to get to be Emperor of Rome. It's very toxic. Don't recommend. So, what do I want to say about these folks? Now, I'm going to hold on to what happens to Titus after this later. This is just their dates. Here are their names. Here are their portraits. Hi, guys. Yeah. In Vespasian's absence, Titus lays siege to Jerusalem, and he does so in a particularly gruesome fashion. He waits until Passover, which at that time was when every Jewish person who could would go to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate Passover together with their families, with their community. This meant that the city of Jerusalem had a population that was well above its normal operating population. This is like invading somebody during a major parade. Like, I guess if you're invading Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July, say, or you're invading the Vatican at Easter, or you're invading Mecca during the Hajj. At any rate, this means that the number of people who need to eat the rapidly dwindling resources inside the city of Jerusalem is high. The death toll is immense. And by now, the Jewish resistance is deeply divided amongst themselves. There are 4 and 3 different factions, all of them controlling different parts of the city of Jerusalem. Titus divides, conquers. He builds a wall around Jerusalem so nobody can sneak supplies in. By doing this, he cracks the siege. And then he had at one point promised not to burn down the temple. And here's where there's a debate. Some people, including Josephus, who's our major source for this period, Josephus begins on the side of the Jewish insurrection, and he switches sides to support Vespasian and Titus. This makes him wildly unpopular in a lot of Jewish circles, but it also is why he survives and why we have his histories. He becomes a historian. He writes a history of the Jewish people, and he also writes a history of this war, which is why we know so much about it. But this also means that our source for this war is a little problematic. He takes the name of his Roman patron, Titus. His name is Flavius Josephus because the Flavian family is Vespasian's family. And Titus continues to be Josephus's wingman. He sets him up with a few Jewish wives who eventually divorce him and leave him sad and alone, if that makes you feel better about Josephus. He doesn't really have a happy life post-collaboration, but then he's also Jewish. His family is inside Jerusalem during the siege, including his parents. His parents die in the fall of Jerusalem. Now, according to Josephus, Titus promises and tries really hard not to destroy the temple. What happens is that some rogue Romans accidentally set the temple on fire, and it just happens to burn down. I am unconvinced. Other reports say that Titus decides, you know what? In order to put this rebellion down for good, we have to destroy this temple. This is the one official temple for most Jews in the Mediterranean who aren't from Samaria. We have to destroy it as an example to others. And the reason why I lean towards this is because even if it had burned down, it still could have been rebuilt. But instead, Titus orders that it be taken apart stone by stone by stone. The only part they can't get rid of is the western wall because it's a load-bearing wall. This is still one of the holiest sites in Jerusalem for Jewish people because it's the last little bit of this second temple built to the god of Judaism. This isn't the only thing that gets dismantled, though. There is a deliberate killing off of anybody of fighting age who hasn't collaborated with the Romans, like Josephus. Younger men in their late teens, are captured, enslaved, and trafficked back to Rome. Older people, women, children are also trafficked and deported back to Rome, enslaved, and then live out the rest of their lives enslaved, either in the city of Rome or elsewhere in the empire. There is a deliberate deportation of Jewish people from Judea. It's one of the most massive attempts under Rome to remove a people from their land. It is unusual for Rome. Even in Carthage and Corinth, where there is a total destruction of the city, and there are mass enslavements, kidnapping, and trafficking of people, there isn't this systematic effort that we see in Judea to remove everybody they can find and enslave them. This is done to make a real specific point. And it's not a specific point being made at Jewish people. Rather, it's being made to everybody else in the empire. If you stand against our new emperor Vespasian, this is what Vespasian is going to do to you. And because Judea is a foreign enemy, it's acceptable to be extra awful to them. And that's what we do. So let's look at some of the monuments to Vespasian's awfulness, starting with the Forum of Vespasian. By this period, the Roman Forum, you remember that from the beginning of the course, the Roman Forum had not been able to handle the foot traffic and the public building needs of the city of Rome for a long time. Under Julius Caesar and Augustus, extra annex forums were built. Vespasian builds another one of these. So this is a courthouse, it's a public library, and there's also a temple included in it. It's like a mini forum. Everything the forum does, the extra fora do as well. There's shop space, there are gardens, and the centerpiece of this particular forum is a temple dedicated to the personified goddess of Pax, of peace. Remember from the Augustus lecture, peace to the Romans doesn't mean a lack of violence, kind of the opposite. This is a temple dedicated to the pacification of Judea, and it's a stark reminder of what Vespasian will do to maintain order and peace in his realm. In the Temple of Peace were displayed spoils from the temple in Jerusalem. So what wasn't lost in the fire was deported, paraded through the streets in a triumph, and then housed in the temple on public display. So things that had formerly been kept in the Holy of Holies, behind veils inaccessible to everybody but priests and only priests on certain days, right? These were the most sacred relics of the religion of the Jewish people. These were now on display for non-believers to look at and gawp at in a temple dedicated to the memory of the Roman victory. This is a very unsubtle way of continuing the subjugation and I'm not going to go with erasure because that's not quite what this is. The example making represented by this military victory. If it makes you feel any better, on the left we're looking at a reconstruction of the Forum of Vespasian. On the right we're looking at what's left of the Temple of Peace. What's left, by the way, is that wall in the back. That's not the Temple of Peace. The rubble on the side is a little bit of the foundations of the Temple of Peace. That brickwork that's clinging to the wall a little bit there in the back is all that's left of the Temple of Peace. You'll notice it is smaller than the western wall of what's left of the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It does make me feel slightly better. Only slightly, though, I'm afraid. Monument number 2, built in the city of Rome in order to commemorate the Roman victory over Judea, is the Arch of Titus. You've met. We looked at the Arch of Titus when we were talking about Roman triumphs. This, if you recall, is a standing memorial to the yoking ceremony, which is part of the Roman defeat ceremony. When a newly defeated enemy is led under a yoke, this collar used to put 2 oxen together to make them plow, it's symbolic of the enslavement and ongoing subjugation of the people who have just been conquered. Inside the arch, on either end, let me turn on the marker so I can draw circles around it. On one side is Titus in his triumphal chariot, and on the other side is the parade showing the menorah from the temple being led through the streets. In years afterwards, Jewish people living in the city of Rome would deliberately avoid walking under this arch, and you had to go out of your way to avoid walking under it because it's built over the sacred road, the Via Sacra. This is the main street leading through downtown Rome and the Forum. More about that in a minute. These are the relief sculptures I was talking about, and they'll look familiar to you. There's Titus in his chariot in triumph. The goddess Nike, the goddess of victory, is standing behind him. And this is the frieze showing the what's left of the carving commemorating the spoils of the triumph. There's the menorah. There are the signs telling you what's in the parade. It's real obvious who's being conquered, where, and why. However, one arch was not enough for Titus. Oh no, because remember, Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, they're also at sword point, yeah? So they build another arch. This is a larger arch that was only recently rediscovered and renamed. This is built on the edge of the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus is on the edge of the Palatine Hill. It's the main chariot racing stadium in the city of Rome, purpose-built out of marble. It's a place where Romans would go many times a year to see various contests, including gladiatorial competitions, but primarily horse racing. This was both a ceremonial venue, but also a place in which, at these festivals, Rome is enacting in miniature these rituals of violence and domination. It's a power move to make people drive fast, unsafe chariots around and around in circles for the delight of your gods and the glorification of your civilization. It is a power move to force enslaved people to fight, sometimes to the death, in order to entertain your people. This is, in miniature, a reenactment of the violence that keeps the Roman Empire coherent and stable. I'm air quoting stable here because I think this is a very toxic way to stabilize your power structure. Onto the arch itself. The arch is built into one of the main entrances to the Circus Maximus itself. I'm going to use my marker here to indicate what I'm talking about. So this red circle I'm drawing is the reconstruction. On the bottom right-hand corner, this here bit, should outline that in another color. Let's, nah, fine. It's fine. You know what I mean. That's what's left, and this is why it took us a while to find it. It's just the foundation. We had to excavate around it to get at it. This was bigger than the Arch of Titus in the Forum. It's in a high-traffic area, but it's not quite as prominent, and it fell out of recognition. It's still important, though. We're not done, however. So we've got, 3 major buildings dedicated to this victory, which is 2 more than you usually get for a Roman victory. This is the last one, and this, incidentally, is why I find the Colosseum actively disturbing. Like, I had somebody give me a Colosseum paperweight, and I'm not comfortable keeping it in my office for a number of reasons. I find blood sport very personally distressing. I mean, call me a radical, but I find the concept of people being forced to kill each other really messed up. This used to be the site of a large ornamental lake at the heart of Nero's palace. One of the reasons why Nero was so gosh darn unpopular was that he used a lot of this revenue that came from the systematic subjugation and abuse of the tax system in the empire, not to build buildings for the public, but to build buildings for him. I'm going to spend a moment, just a moment, giving you Nero's probable case for this. Nero's house wasn't just Nero's house, remember. The emperor's house, like any upper-class Roman house, was both a public and a private space. By now, the emperors were hearing legal cases, they were meeting foreign dignitaries. Their household was the civil service. Enslaved people and freed people connected with the house of the emperor were running the day-to-day mechanics of the Roman civil service. For all of these reasons, the emperor needed more and more house space. That said, Nero's palace didn't just contain administrative areas, in fact, not primarily. It also contained some really unnecessarily elaborate rooms, including a rotating dining room that was on ball bearings, so like the dining room rotated while you were in there eating. It also included gardens, an ornamental lake, and a giant statue of Nero that was called the Colossus of Nero. Colossus is a Roman word for an unnecessarily giant statue, which is what was there. This was left in place, and this is why this is sometimes called the Colosseum, because it's the building, the Aeum, that's right near the Colossus, the unnecessarily large statue of Nero. This was one of Nero's moves towards self-deification. Should you ever need to deify yourself, keep this in mind. One of the first steps to classic self-deification is making an unnecessarily giant statue of yourself and putting it in a prominent location. When Vespasian came to power, he had to deal with the house question, because the money had already been spent. The house was already there. Nero called it his golden palace, which gives you an idea of what this place was like. It was encrusted with gemstones, super glittery. It was just a lot of money had already been spent. Dismantling it meant a lot of sunk cost. The raw materials could still be useful, but you also had to get the labor to do this. And Vespasian inherited from Nero a budget crisis. If you had to guess whether Nero is good at balancing a budget or not, my impression, and it would be a correct impression, is that he wasn't very good at balancing a budget. Most irresponsible autocrats are not very good at balancing budgets. And in order to maintain his power, he had relied very heavily on excess binge spending on pet projects. There's also a bit of a problem with autocracy, as autocrats are hard to say no to, and they like to build stuff that they want to have. Caligula did it, Nero did it. What Vespasian ends up doing is he dismantles large portions of the palace. He takes the raw materials to try to balance the budget. He also introduces a system of taxation, yes, in the provinces, but also in the city of Rome proper. Everything he can think to tax, he taxes, including pee from the public latrines. Before this point, it was a recognized custom that people who needed human urine in order to run their businesses, oh my goodness, you may ask, human urine businesses? Human urine was regularly used as a cleaning product. It's also big in pharmacy, but if human urine is aged, especially male human urine, it creates natural ammonia, which does indeed clean and bleach things. It was the go-to bleaching agent before the late 1800s, and it's a renewable resource. It's pretty ecologically responsible. I'm not going to try it, but it's not the worst thing you could be doing in your civilization. Vespasian started taxing people who wanted to take the pea and use it in their business. And there was a protest. People were like, Vespasian, dude, you're going to tax pea? It's pea. Pea is free. And Vespasian's like, well, look, does the money stink? No. So, yeah, we're going to tax it. I kind of respect Vespasian for this. At least he's willing to tax the city of Rome as well as the rest of the empire. Yay. I'm not his biggest fan, though, I have to admit. No. But I guess he's better than Nero in some ways. At any rate, this brings me to the Colosseum. This used to be that ornamental lake I mentioned in Nero's palace. Vespasian drains it, uses the foundations because it was a fake lake, so it already had some nice waterproof foundations. He builds this amphitheater around it, this round structure for viewing gladiatorial competitions and other sorts of public displays. He does it using the new labor that he has just enslaved in his victory in Judea. A lot of the people who were starved in the siege of Jerusalem, whose families were slaughtered in the fall of Judea, were taken from their homeland and forced to labor unreasonable hours and unsafe conditions to build this building. So every stone that you see in this building was built with enslaved labor from Vespasian's conquest of Judea. The first people who died fighting in this arena were Jewish captives from the Jewish victory. This means that the first blood to inaugurate the Colosseum were survivors of a desperate armed conflict, a failed fight for independence, in a conflict that led to a massive act of erasure and violence against one of the major religions of the ancient Mediterranean. This went on to be a place of execution for many years after that. So, although professional gladiators could expect to live through most of their bouts if they're fighting in the Colosseum, not everything that went on in the Colosseum was gladiatorial competitions. One of the ways that Romans would execute the death penalty on people of lower status, so enslaved people, freed people, immigrants, people without a lot of money, people from lower social classes, the most vulnerable people in Roman society under Roman law, including poor citizens, when convicted of major crimes, would be sent to the Colosseum and then executed either in one-sided fights with professional fighters or in combat with wild animals who themselves were kidnapped and trafficked from all corners of the empire to fight and eventually die in combat for the entertainment of the Roman masses. So if human cruelty isn't enough for you, animal cruelty is going on here too. There's like 24/7 Tiger King in progress with an added dose of imperialism and religious erasure and persecution. It continues to be a site for ritualized, institutionalized violence against vulnerable people for centuries to come, including religious dissidents, Jewish people, Christians, Druids, sometimes cultists of Dionysus, people accused of treason. What we're looking at here is a monument built by brutalized hands. Sorry, I told you this gets me very upset. Actually, I'm not sorry, because I think this is something that we should be upset by. Yeah, this is a good thing to be troubled by. This is a graveyard watered with the blood of the victims of the Roman Empire. And it's not just that people died here, but they died while being objectified for the entertainment of other Romans many of whom themselves were the descendants of enslaved people, trafficked people, victims of war, who had then bought into the Roman system. This phenomenon of blood sport and public executions was used strategically by imperial power to make an example out of people, but also to objectify the enemies of empire in the same way that people in Spartacus's revolt were objectified by the crucifixion ritual. This is meant to make you, as the audience, have to make a choice. Either when you look down onto those sands and you watch people being slaughtered, you have to contend in your heart with the fact that you're watching human beings like yourself, who could be you and your family and your kids and your mom and your dad, dying in front of you. Or you disconnect, you dehumanize, you side with the empire and you say, oh no, these aren't real people. They're not innocent people like the people I care about. These are people who are bad people. They have rebelled. They're criminals. They're from the wrong people group. They worship the wrong god. They are not like us, and therefore they are less human than us, and we don't have to react to their death as if they were human. I personally don't think that that goes away because it's 2,000 years ago, yeah? To me, I think because I spend so much time with them, ancient people are still people. So when I look at this, it does upset me. For reasons I think are valid and important. And even though, yeah, Gladiator is my favorite movie, part of why Gladiator is not my favorite, but one of my favorite movies, is that Gladiator makes it really clear that that's what's going on. That the arena, yeah, is a place where there's some opportunity for resistance narratives, and yes, some gladiators can be superstars, but essentially the arena, the Colosseum, is a microcosm in which Rome is exercising ongoing terrorist activity in order to maintain power. Even in times of relative peace, the body count is continuing to mount here. This is a political system that's based on the blood of the oppressed, many of whom I think we would consider innocent, and a legal system that I can say, as a person whose research specialty is in part Roman law, is not an equal legal system. This is a legal system that unfairly and disproportionately punishes the most vulnerable people in this society. And that's how I feel about this. It makes me really sad, and it literally makes me cry, and I'm okay with that. You know? I think it's important to go there and realize what we're looking at, because after 2,000 years, it's tempting to not buy into the humanity of people who've been dead for that long. Hey, little man. Hello, Mr. Spouse. Thank you. See? He's upset too. Romans are oppressive. We're raising him right, I'm sure. Okay. On to our next thing. I'm so sorry, guys. My professional dignity is like permanently undercut by this whole situation. Okay, on we go. Now, I mentioned that all of these monuments are happening in an important context. This is what I mean by this. You remember, I'm sure, from when I made you label a map at the beginning of the semester, the Capitoline and Palatine Hill, downtown Rome. Here, this entire area labeled Domus Augustiana, this is the palace complex of Augustus that sprawls out later under Nero to include the site of the future Flavian amphitheater. There's the Roman Forum down leading up to the Capitoline Hill. So there's the Palatine, the Capitoline, a bunch of basilicas and imperial fora, and then connecting all of this together, you see a road leading right by the Temple of Venus in Rome between the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, and the Forum of Vespasian. If you walk down this road, which is the road that you have to walk down to access one part of the Forum to another part of the Forum, you're going to pass the Forum of Vespasian and the Temple of Peace. You're going to walk under the Arch of Titus, or around it if you're resisting the violence narrative. And then you're going to approach the Flavian Amphitheater. If you go in the other direction, around the Circus Maximus, you're probably still going to have to go by one of these buildings, and then you're going to see yet another arch honoring the Flavian victory over Judea. This geography of downtown Rome is really important, because this doesn't happen just because of anti-Semitic douche nozzlery, although that's part of what's going on. This is using your building program to make a point, and this is in a time of budget crisis, yeah. Even in a budget crisis, Vespasian thinks that building these buildings is important because he's got to build a dynasty and he's got to convince other people not to kill him. And this is something that's a little bit tragic if you think about it, that one of the victims of Vespasian is Vespasian's sense of peace and also his family dynamic. His son Titus has a very brief time as emperor, and it goes very poorly for him. Titus's first year in charge of Rome, AD 79 CE, just made a point about that. 79 CE is also the year of another famous natural disaster, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. With the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the playground of the wealthy elites of Rome is covered in a volcanic eruption. Several high-profile officials die, including my bestie, Pliny the Elder, who's also problematic. Full disclosure, Pliny the Elder owned people. He used enslaved labor. He used enslaved labor to write his book that I'm working with and I'm very fond of, so I'm aware it's a thing. Domitian, the little brother, constantly struggles to maintain his power, and ultimately he dies in a palace coup. Vespasian's victory is kind of a hollow one, because I didn't finish Titus. So Vesuvius blows up, then Rome burns down, then Titus gets sick and dies. It's almost like somebody divine was upset with him. Yeah, Domitian has a long-ish reign, but not a happy one. He's very unpopular after his death. And with his death, there's another political crisis that the elites of Rome, for once, pull together to solve, putting Nerva in charge. This leads to a period of relative stability that, alas, we're just not going to have the time to unpack, and it's not important as such. With Vespasian, we've created our bed, and Rome is going to have to lie in it for the next couple centuries. It's not a comfortable lie. It's not good for Rome in some ways, in a lot of ways, and it's certainly a difficult situation for people who have to live in Rome's world. I'm going to tease a little bit an author I'm going to touch on when we talk about Rome and Britain. In his biography of his father-in-law, the historian Tacitus gives us a scene wherein a general on the edge of empire in what's today Scotland is facing off against Tacitus's hero, the General Agricola. Into that character's mouth, Tacitus puts these words, which are some of my favorites in all Latin literature. It translates, when Romans make a wasteland, they call it pax, they call it peace. It's not a coincidence that Tacitus lives in the generation after the Flavians. He's a young man when the Flavians come to power, His legal career proceeds under the Emperor Domitian, and then after that dynasty ends, he's left to deal with the legacy of living under this ultimately very repressive and violent regime, like pretty much every regime in ancient Rome. But his comment here is really telling, that it's not just Rome's enemies who are noticing that Rome is super destructive and not very good for the political landscape. It's Romans themselves who start saying, hey, first, our imperial growth's kind of unsustainable. We're paying a huge cost in manpower to maintain this empire, and while it's nice that we have access to all of these luxury goods, we're also less safe than we were. Our enemies continue to multiply, and in some ways we've become the thing that we're supposed to hate. We're supporting regimes that look a lot like kings. We are participating in the oppression of people who are fighting for their freedom. And part of Rome's whole deal is that they love this concept of freedom and plurality. The fact that empire comes at the expense of both troubles Romans. And they realize that they're causing a lot of damage. This, in particular, is why I don't feel like I'm being unfair to Romans when I point out that a lot of their political decision-making is problematic. Because Romans who live under this regime, even people who participate in these regimes, as Tacitus did, are themselves aware that their presence in this world is problematic, in much the same way I'm aware that my impact on the world is problematic in a number of ways. One of the bits of good news is that some Romans try to come up with solutions. We see the beginnings of pacifist movements, of philosophical movements that try to limit the amount of violence that people do. We see people protesting the power and the decisions of emperors. We see a lot of resistance at high levels to self-defeating and destructive imperial policy. And we also see one of the earliest environmental movements come out of this period. One of the reasons why I continue to have a fond spot for Pliny the Elder, despite having some real moral qualms about the way he lived his life, is that Pliny the Elder is one of our earliest environmental advocates. He was really concerned about the destruction Roman mining practices were causing, about the ways in which international trade was incentivizing unsustainable methods of gathering things, about the way human lives were being lost in pursuit of luxury goods that weren't necessary for life. He stops an entire discussion of sea life to talk about how messed up it was that people were willing to pay money for pearls when human beings died diving into the depths of the sea to get the pearls out. He points out, pearls don't save lives. You don't need pearls to survive. There's no reason to go down there to get them. People die doing it. And how messed up is it that we're willing to pay blood money to have a pretty twinkly thing on our outfits? That's kind of nifty. He talks about deforestation, about unnatural landscapes, about invasive species. A lot of the things that we see out of modern ecological movements have their roots in Roman protests to the destructive environmental effects of Roman imperialism. And that's kind of nifty. So if you need something to feel good about after this very, very depressing lecture, in what is, I'm afraid, a bit of a depressing class, there is that. Within this landscape, there are increasingly organized and ultimately some successful resistance movements that emerge and create the kinds of intellectual frameworks that now give us so much more groundwork to make better choices about our lives. And in some ways, I've been very judgy about the Romans, but we have 2,000 more years worth of philosophical thought, of strategies, of options, of ways of being in the world that should make us hopefully kinder, less destructive, less unjust in the way we deal with the world around us. But I can still recognize a lot of Rome in the foreign policy decisions I see being made under my watch, both as a citizen and watching the international community. We're still in a world with genocide. We're still in a world where foreign wars happen in part to serve the interests of people who don't even live there. We're willing to take human lives over oil. We're willing to support industry at the expense of sustainability. And that troubles me. Much like average Romans, it's hard to know how to make morally correct decisions in a world that makes it much more convenient to destroy. But this is something where I feel a connection with my ancient Roman authors. They are problematic, and so am I. I'm fine with admitting that. Their struggle is akin to my struggle, and I have the benefit of 2,000 years to kind of cope with it. And the fact that they, like I, am troubled by the world they've inherited makes me feel less alone. It makes me feel heard. It makes me feel seen. And it makes me feel like what I do matters. And sometimes as a historian, you have to ask yourself that. Certainly other people ask us this all the time, like, why do you deserve to exist when you're talking about ancient Romans all the time? Like, isn't that kind of unnecessary and impractical? I'm not going to try to sell you on this. But for me, and really, I'm the only person whose heart and mind I can have any control over here, part of why I do what I do is because I think there is value to putting modern eyes on ancient history. And especially in the world we're in, a lot of it looks very much like the Romans. And understanding why the Romans did what they did and what happened because of it, we can perhaps be better positioned to do better, to choose justice when justice is available to us, to choose compassion, to choose kindness, to choose plurality, to choose acceptance, to choose humanity. Studying ancient history helps us to make the kind of decisions that preserve and promote not only human life, but also life. And that does make me get out of bed every morning, even when I'm keeping my pajama pants on. On that note, I miss you guys dreadfully. I hope you're doing okay. And as usual, I urge you to be well, take care of your folks, and stay classy until next we virtually hang out. Ciao, folks.